Good morning, everybody. My name is Alondra Cano, and I am the chair of the Public Safety and Emergency Management Committee. Today is January 8th, 2020. We are convening here as the committee with council members Steve Fletcher and Lene Palmisano. Although we are not a quorum of the committee, what we're going to do is just go ahead and begin the presentation. And once we are joined by our colleagues to reach quorum, we will be able to officially receive and file the presentation today, as well as adopt the agenda. So for information purposes, I will go ahead and read the agenda that is before us today. Item number 1 is receiving and filing public comment from the community regarding any public safety issue. Item number 2 is a consent item, which is authorizing an increase to a contract with the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension for DNA analysis of police department case evidence. And item number 3 is a presentation on the Minneapolis Police Department's procedural justice work. So let's go ahead and begin with public comment. If there are any individuals in the audience today who are here to share public comment, this would be the time to do so. Seeing no public comments today from the community, we shall go ahead and move down to the discussion item. We will go ahead and take up the consent item once we have quorum so we can actually approve that and move it forward. So we are joined today by our Minneapolis police leaders and staff members. And so if you want to go ahead and come up to the microphone and queue up your presentation, please go ahead and introduce yourselves and then walk us through the information you have.
Good morning, City Council members. My name is Arthur Knight. I'm Chief of Staff, Chief Arredondo.
Good morning, council members. My name is Glenn Burke. I was the project site coordinator for our procedural justice work.
Good morning. I'm Dayton Dubuc. I am a sergeant in charge of the procedural justice unit.
We have it up on our laptop, but it's just not showing on the screen.
Did it work earlier?
Yeah, earlier they had it up.
Yeah, I didn't. Yes. I mean, it worked earlier. Oh. Okay, different input. Was on 7. Yeah. Is he switching them?
There we go.
All right. Go for it. You want to?
Yeah. So again, good morning. Happy New Year. Thanks for having us here today. My name again is Art Knight. I'm a Deputy Chief of Staff for Chief Arredondo. The units under me are the Community Engagement Unit, the Procedural Justice Unit, Community Navigators, CSOs, which is our Community Service Officers, Recruitment, Background, and Chaplains. Today we're talking about our Procedural Justice Unit. What I want to do first is show a video that Chief Arredondo have explain our procedural justice training. As you can tell, I don't think I have too many technical guys behind me, but they do a pretty good presentation.
No, we're not getting any sound.
The sound worked earlier.
Yeah.
But remember where it clicked in there, and you hit the volume in there, you turned it down.
Mm-hmm.
Community. It's the expectation that you're going to go out there and
Turn it up.
Should be all the way up.
There you go. Go back there. Go to there. Right there. See the volume? Yep, in that box right there. Yep. There we go.
I don't want to.
procedural justice is just the way in which our men and women are out there serving the community. It's the expectation that you're going to go out there and serve the community in a way that is both fair, that is building trust and legitimacy amongst them. It is still continuing to do your job, but it is doing so in a way where they look at more so the process as opposed to the outcome. And if that process and how you're dealing with the community is looked upon as being fair and respectful, it will not matter what the outcome is. They will know that they have been treated in a way that gives them both respect and dignity in that process, regardless of the outcome. It's really the golden rule. It's just treating people the way you'd want to be treated. Part of it is understanding our role in the community. We all get this shiny badge on us and we take the oath on day one. But it's really a little bit of a deeper dive in understanding the significance of our role and what the community expects from us, and how we, in order to be successful as peace officers, it's knowing and understanding the dynamics which occur out in our communities on a daily basis, but also knowing that every momentary action that we have with a community member can be very impactful for the good and also for the bad, depending upon that contact and that interaction. We are really out there to do the best we can. The majority of the people out there support the work that we do, and the relationships that we can build with those communities can really move the dial forward in terms of our relationship, continuing to build that trust and legitimacy, and making officers feel good about the job they're doing.
And these are the 4 pillars of procedural justice. Talk about, and also have Glenn Burt do a background on procedural justice training.
Council members, thank you. The beginning of the Seeds of Procedural Justice began, unfortunately, after the shooting of Trayvon Martin, when President Obama gathered 300 leaders from law enforcement, academia, religious leaders, to come together and try to find out if there was a scientific and steady solution to try to stop the unfortunate shootings of unarmed black males and also other people of color. Out of this came 21st century policing, which became the foundation, and one of the pillars of that was procedural justice. So with that, slide down, with that, the National Initiative for Building Community Trust and Justice was formed. We became one of the recipients of a grant to participate in that. We were one of the original cities. And so through that, working with the Justice Collaboratory at Yale University, the Center for Policing Equity, and at UCLA, John Jay University, and the Urban Institute, we were selected in 2015 to be one of the pilot cities. Former Chief Hartow selected a team of MPD leaders to launch that effort. I was selected as the project site coordinator, along with Chief Arredondo and Chief Knight, Chief Forrest, and Lieutenant Darcy Horn, and also Sergeant Alice White and Sergeant Butch Bloward. We began to train the entire department and also reach out in the community to talk about our procedural justice efforts and find ways to blend that within everything that we do. It was a sea change in our policing strategy, and it's become a core tenet of what we do. Throughout time, we've adapted and kind of further cemented it. We created a procedural justice unit in 2017, and then later we created a procedural justice division to make sure that we had all the different pieces together to make sure that effort kept moving, and we take that momentum and continue to fold it into what we do. The pilot sites were Stockton, California, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, ourselves, Gary, Indiana, Fort Worth, Texas, and Birmingham, Alabama. The significance of this was we had multiple regions in the country. We had different types of departments, some large, some small, some minority majority in cities and departments. And so it gave a very good cross-section of different types of policing, different types of cities, different types of situations. And we were lucky enough because we had the capacity and the willingness to do the work, but we also have one of the most diverse communities. So we have different issues than some of the other places that we could work on.
Right, so the way I came in contact with procedural justice actually as an officer when he first got rolled out throughout the whole police department. They trained the whole police department 24 hours of procedural justice, which is procedural justice 1, 2, and 3. One was the introduction in police legitimacy. The second one was technical mindset and also scenario base. And PJ3, which is my favorite, is about implicit bias and how to diffuse some of the traps that sometimes officers might get into as they're interacting with the public. When I first got introduced in procedural justice as an officer, going through the class when former Lieutenant Knight was given it, I really, really liked it. I'm from Canada, originally grew up there, so I grew up very differently than a lot of people, and I really liked the basic of it and what it was about. I understood pretty clearly that a lot of officers sometimes were saying that that kind of material has been around for a long, long time. We've been in existence for 151 years now. A lot of police officers have been doing a lot of great work for a long, long time. And procedural justice is kind of now it's become in the 2019, the 2015, since 2015, it's kind of what the name it's been. As you can see right now, we also, when I took over, I was the second group of instructor for procedural justice. And I seeked out that position because I felt that we could take this to the next level. And what I felt was, no matter how much training we did internally, if the feeling of the community was that we're still not doing what we're supposed to be doing, we're kind of in a way failing. And we had to make sure that we took this training outside of the office of police and take it to the community. So, excuse me, I'm sick. Taking it to the community so they can understand what the officers are being taught and what the expectation they may have from the police department. And it was important for them to also understand what their power and what they could expect from us. We took it out also to security staff downtown. I run a lot of part-time downtown, so I did some training with security staff. As we work hand in hand with the police department and security staff, they're kind of the first line of defense, dealing with some of the businesses and also the clubs. So we did some training, some de-escalation, some procedural justice training. So like Chief Knight talked about the 4 pillars. And the reason why I call it VNERDS, for officers to be reminded, make it easy for them to remember. V stand for the voice. So it's important for officers to give people a voice. Listen. A lot of times problems actually solve themselves if you just listen to people. The second one is the N for neutrality. No matter who we're dealing with, North Minneapolis, South Minneapolis, downtown, people want to see that your actions are neutral, no matter who you're dealing with. The third one is respect, which I think is basically the most important one. It doesn't matter who you are. That's one thing that you should always lead with, is with respect, to get respect. And the last one is trust. How do you build trust in communities where you never had trust? And how do you maintain trust with communities that you may not have trust, lost it, and trying to get it back? Or sometimes just maintaining the trust that you've built over the years. We also expanded it to the response to serious incidents. So what we're doing now in the Procedural Justice Unit is when there's a serious incident, could be a shooting, a stabbing, homicide, and how can we, as a unit, working also with the community engagement team and the community navigators, to make victim whole again as soon as possible. So we created a document, which we can give you a copy of that, and we put all of the stakeholders that could be helpful in dealing and handling some of those situations. And again, how do we bring the victims whole again? We also have now under procedural justice the conduct on licensed premise, which some of you, I'm sure, are very familiar with. For some of you that are not, it's the new process of how do we handle rental properties and how do we keep people housed, which was some of the issues we had in the past. So I'd love to go more into that, but I know I don't have that much time. So what we've done is a lot of training and education. The entire police department, civilian and sworn, important to mention, and also community members. Reviewing policies and procedures, implementation of collective healing processes, which Glenn will go into this a little bit deeper after. Their crime prevention strategies with GVI, the Group Violence Intervention, and Sasha Cotton. Increasing attention and outreach, specifically in minorities, communities. I've built a lot of partnership for the past 2 years with A Mother's Love, with Children's Home Society Lutheran Services, to where now, not only do we have those relationships, but now we can use each other to help out. I'll give you a perfect example. We had a young African-American male that was frustrated at school, broke a window, and he was sentenced to 16 hours of community service. Children's Home Society of Lutheran Services called me and said, hey, what can we do with this gentleman? Well, picking up trash on the side of the road or cleaning up sidewalks, I don't think was very good use of his time. So what I've done is I partnered him up with My Mother's Love, and they went and walked the beat. And he was able to be mentored by people, part of that group, as they were walking instead of picking up trash. The evaluation, we do evaluation after all of our training of the officers of what they're retaining, what they remember prior to the training. Also, like I mentioned earlier, the PJ 1, 2, and 3, we do now yearly ongoing procedural justice review and also historical trauma. In 2017, we did African American and Native American, and this year we did the LGBTQIA+ community and the Latinx community. And right now in January, we're looking at what we're going to be doing this fall. There's several options that we may pick from, but every year we're looking for a group of people that live in our community, and how can we educate officers a little bit more about that community? So when they do interact with that community, they have a background of certain things that the do's and don'ts, or things that might be different than what they used to. So it's basically just providing them tools, put more tools in their tool belt, so when they deal with that community, they have a better understanding. I think I'll talk about or involve highlighting. So we also look at policies review, which Deputy Chief and I may talk a bit more about that if you may have questions. But we review policies to make sure that they're procedurally just. We want to make sure that we get it right, we involve the community and the police officers, and get some input and make sure that we get them right.
I'm learning how to use this. We have new microphones now, and I'm trying to figure out how hard to push a button. So we have a question or a comment from Councilmember Palmisano.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just one slide back, perhaps 2 slides back. I was curious, you'd mentioned this in the beginning of your presentation, but I was curious what you mean in the first part of the procedural justice when you talk about police legitimacy. Could you help me understand? It's probably a term that in the police world they understand. To us, that means something a little different. And then what defeating traps is in, I think, the third part. Could you just go into that a little bit?
For sure. So the first part of PJ1 was the basic of procedural justice. So we talked about those pillars earlier. And the police legitimacy is how can we, the work that we do in the community, how can we be seen legitimate? So by using those 4 pillars of procedural justice, being neutral, respecting people, listening to what people have to say before making decisions is what's going to bring the police legitimacy. So all the actions that the police are going to be taking in the community are going to be seen as legitimate. So we go through scenarios. We talk about a lot of things to make sure that we succeed in doing that. So the PJ1 is really driving the force of those 4 pillars of how important it is to build that relationship with people. Because In a lot of communities, there's never been trust. So it's really hard, and I think it's important for officers to understand that concept, that when an officer show up in uniform, it brings a lot of pain, a lot of history behind it. So understanding that concept, so when you make contact with people, people may not be happy to see you, or they might see you as something different in what you are, what you're thinking, or why you're here to do. So it's important for you to listen to them and basically like explain to them why you're there and why you're doing what you're doing. And sometimes just taking the extra 2 minutes to explain that so people understand. So that's that legitimacy.
You know, Councilmember, you asked a great question about traps. And when we talk about fast traps, we're really talking about implicit bias. And I can tell you a story like it was a police officer who did a traffic stop. Now, I can follow anyone for 4 blocks. So it was a car full of black males. And I was looking at the video of the officer followed for 4 blocks and failed to stop at a stop sign. And he said, and the occupant's like, why did you pull me over? Because they said, I think you pulled me over just because it was a car of 4 black males in a car. And the officer said, no, the reason I pulled you over is because you didn't stop at the stop sign. So just having a conversation with this officer, I said, now, if that car had, like you say, 2 elderly white females in it, would you have followed that car? So in that officer's mind, he saw a car of 4 black males, and in his mind, it just clicked, something must be wrong. So I followed that car. So now his justification is, the reason I stopped that car is because it ran through that stop sign. No, you follow that vehicle for 4 blocks. So when you talk about fast traps, implicit bias, false perceptions you have about people you may not even recognize, and then you go off those. So when we train our officers, are you going off your own biases, or if you going off those actions of those people? And a lot of this came from Dr. Phil Goff, and that information is included too. Yeah, great question.
A big part of procedural justice, our procedural justice work, is collective healing. It began with the concept of reconciliation, but in reaching out with communities, in many cases, that word was rejected because in many communities, if we were never together, how can we reconcile? And so we began to really think about that and say, well, we need to collective healing. We need to, first of all, listen to the stories and narratives and understand them, and also share our perspectives so that we can try to work together and at least create a baseline level of understanding. That's part of the historical work that we do in the trauma and just the cultural awareness to be able to understand that law enforcement has a role, but part of that role is service to community, and part of that service is listening and understanding and creating greater understanding. And so when we get those narratives, they're believable, they're lived experiences. And to understand that better, to say, hey, I understand that it may not be the way you grew up or where you live or how you live, but it's true and real and lived. And you are the first line of government. You are the most obvious form of government. You are stepping into a situation in a community that may not have had a great experience with you or your type or that uniform. I always like to say that everyone understands this part of that uniform. It's our job to get communities to understand this part of it. And that's that part that we're trying to do through collective healing. And part of what we're doing with that is creating opportunities for the chief, police chiefs to acknowledge harm and listen to community grievances. Truly listen and try to understand and absorb that and reflect that in a positive manner. Small group circles, developing a narrative gathering capacity, that's part of the community navigator's role, and convening local researchers. We did a lot of studies from outside sources. We need to start to build that up locally, understanding that. Considering models for broader engagement. Once again, that's looking around the country, looking at best practices, looking at what's not being done. Like I said, once again, I'm partial. Community navigators is part of that. It's a different type of engagement because we know that the studies have shown us that in many cases, communities, they see that uniform and it creates an instant barrier. But when we have some folks who aren't wearing that uniform but still represent the police department and sit in that space in between law enforcement and community, we can maybe get a better response. We can maybe get a better relationship built, and that's what we're working on. In mobilizing communication resources is understanding that it just may not we need to create more ways for us to really talk and really listen. And part of what we're doing with that is, like I said, community navigators and subpopulation work. African American distrust was the first focus amongst equals. We looked at youth. We're working with youth, LGBTQA plus community, Native American community, victims of intimate partner and domestic violence. We know that's one of our leading drivers, so we want to focus on that. Latinx community and new arrival immigrant communities, our East African communities, Southeast Asian communities, trying to create bridges that have that built internally and be really mindful of how we do that. And what we're doing with the formal research, we have a lot of federal partners and great federal partners who help us do that. Our internal research, Sergeant Book talked about our procedural justice surveys that we do before and after every training, community surveys, which you have some of the results there in your booklets, impact evaluation, which is another thing that's within the booklet, and gap analysis and research solicitations. Looking at ourselves critically and utilizing our own resources to figure out what are we missing, and then hopefully that local research can help us fill that and figure out what we could be doing better.
Hold on one second. I want to step back and talk about community surveys. Traditionally, when you looked at some departments across the country, when they did community surveys, they actually did surveys in the most affluent neighborhoods. And then what the National Initiative actually did, they looked at our crime maps, and they looked at data, our most impoverished communities, north side, south side, our communities that had the highest rate of domestic and violence. And that is actually what we did our surveys from. And I can tell you, it wasn't a pretty picture when you look at the results, but I would rather have that information from the citizens who live in our most impoverished neighborhoods, who we have the most interaction with, to see how they feel about us. So when we did these community surveys, that's where the information was. And it's not glamorous, I tell you that now.
Thank you, Chief. And what we're doing still to make connections and build bridges, we have biweekly technical assistant calls where we're finding new opportunities to sustain the work, trying to figure out different ways to expand the influence of these concepts, connect with different stakeholders, improve communication, and part of what my role is to study pilot stakeholders for the best practices. And we've done some national level peer exchanges with Gary, Indiana, Fort Worth, Texas, Stockton, and Birmingham, Alabama, to see what they're doing, because something that they're doing that may solve one of their issues, we can probably take a piece of or a part of, and also we can help them sometimes, because like in my role, we have a lot of places around the country where there are new arrival immigrant communities are starting to burgeon, and they don't have that experience like we do. And it's good for us to be partners and to be able to say, well, this is what we're doing here with our community. This is how we're responding to those type of things. And it's actually gone international. We've had a few departments from Malmo, Sweden, and one from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, a contingent that wanted to ask us how we are doing things. And so that was interesting, because these are issues that we only think of kind of in our small lens, but it's actually a worldwide concern.
All right, so in conclusion, I know one of the questions that City Council Cano asked is, when is procedural justice going to be over, the training? It will never be over. It's an ongoing thing. It's something that from the first day you're hired to the last time when you retire, that we're going to be talking about. It is the basic of the whole police department. If in 5 years and 10 years we don't talk about this, there'll be a failure. Because I truly believe that those 4 pillars, if officers go about their business every single day, treating people the way they should be, you want to be treated, we wouldn't have all those issues that we might be having. And that's why it's an ongoing process. We train every single cadet academy, the recruit academy, and every single year officers come back and are reminded of what the pillars are, what we stand for as a police department, and why it's important to do it.
One thing I want to touch on too lastly, when Chief Arredondo says a culture change, and we just celebrated last year 150 years of the police department. And I tell people the change won't happen overnight. I remember the first year we did all the training. So we had 880 officers trained. almost 200 civilian staff. And I remember a staff person in the records unit came up to me, and she said, Lieutenant Knight, did you guys train the whole department? I said, yep. She said, well, sometimes I think it didn't work. I said, why? And she said, I dealt with one of your cops today, and one of your cops was a complete a-hole. And here's what I told her. I said, you know, I would love to have a perfect department, but it's not perfect. But I said the vast majority of officers are perfect. And you might have dealt with one a-hole a day, but I think last month you might have dealt with 3, right? She said, yeah. So you do see that reduction. And the last piece I want to talk about is trauma. We talk about the trauma that officers face, and we want to talk about internal PJ too. We cannot expect officers who's suffering from trauma to go out there and be effective with the community. And again, I've came on in 1992. I'm going on 28 years, and I can think of everything I saw. So having those conversations with our officers. But here's where I flip it with my officers. I said we have some officers who had 30 years of trauma, but we have some communities that have generation after generation after generation of trauma. So you think about it, you have police officers on this job who've been doing trauma their whole career, going from call to call to call. And I can tell you, growing up in the African-American community, when I was 10 years old in Chicago, I remember my first friend who was hit by a car and died. I remember when I was 13, my first friend who was shot. When I was 16, one of my friends was shot and killed by the police. And this is not just my experience, but a lot of people in the communities we deal with, the trauma they face too. So we have to really do something about the trauma within the police department and the trauma within the community too. Thank you guys so much.
I wanted to make a note that we have been joined by Council Vice President Andrea Jenkins and Councilmember Philippe Cunningham. We have probably a few questions and thoughts, so we'll start with Councilmember Fletcher and then Councilmember Cunningham.
Thank you, Chair. This is great. I really think that there's a lot in this framework that is really appealing and that's really aligned with a lot of the feedback that we get, both from people who are really aligned with and appreciative of the police, and from people who are skeptical of MPD. And we see in the survey there's a good share of both of those in our community, right? But I think a lot of the direction that people want to go is really figuring out how do we make sure that there's trust? How do we make sure that people feel they're being treated fairly? So I really appreciate this framework. Can you talk a little more about the Procedural Justice Unit? How many people are in it? What do they do? When I hear that, I always wonder, is there a danger of it being siloed? Is there a danger of saying, like, procedural justice happens in the Procedural Justice Unit, and if I'm just at the first precinct, then I don't have to worry about it? So I guess that's kind of, the thing I want to help people understand a little bit is who's doing procedural justice, and what are the people who are in the Procedural Justice Unit actually doing?
Sure. So the structure is Deputy Chief Knight is the head of the Procedural Justice Unit. Then we have Commander Adams. And then we have Lieutenant Kaz right here. She joined the unit in October, right? So I believe it's October, and I'm the sergeant. So Lieutenant Kaz is in charge of more than just the Procedural Justice Unit. She's in charge of the community engagement team, the community navigators, the community service officer, the chaplain services. So on a daily activities, I'm in charge of the Procedural Justice Unit. So we have 3 officers working. And each of them have projects that they're working on individually. Most of them are involving, for example, one of my Officer Wilkes, works at the Shakopee Women's Prison. She created a 12-week training project with all the ladies that work there. So when they do come back to our communities, they're better informed and better equipped to be able to handle whatever they're going to be handling. We have Officer Bulk, which is a 26-year veteran of the military. He's been an officer for a while, and has a lot of experience on CIT, so crisis intervention. So we create a program with our CIT team to teach, and including procedural justice, because the chief really his vision is that in everything that we teach, procedural justice is at the center, at the core of everything that we're teaching. It could be use of force, de-escalation, anything you can imagine, any call you might answer, any contact with the citizen. And also, like me, when I took over, like I said, I think it was important to push it out to the community and make sure that the community understand what we're being taught, and I educate them of what they could be expecting from the officers, and making sure that that line of communication is open. Because if people are going through something, and they say they're being treated disrespectfully, but they don't have a contact, somebody, an ally on the inside that may listen to them and understand them, we're losing all that information. And to me, that's how you can be accountable, is you have to have those lines of communication open. And you have to tell people, please, I need to know when something is not going right. Because like Chief talked about, is this something that somebody has to be retrained? Is this something that somebody's suffering from something else from the job is going on at home that we need to address because of all the trauma that officers have been going through? So I think it's important to have a different approach that we used to have. Right away, we're not going to jump in the officer's throat. We're going to try to understand what else is going on and why is this happening. And now with the body-worn camera, it's very helpful watching the video and making sure we're getting back to people. Because one of the number one complaints that I get all the time is people will say, I made a complaint, but I never heard back. So there's a missing part that we have to be accountable, making sure that even though we might exhaust everything that we've done, we have to make that call back. Take that extra 5 minutes, say, hey, just want to let you know, the complaint that you made was heard, was dealt with, this is what happened, and this is where we're at. If there's more information or whatever that might be, and make sure to get back to people. And that's, I think, the big piece that was missing before is like they never hear back. And that's what me being in the community, working with RCCS, working with the NAACP, working with the Mother's Love, working with Children's Home Society, all those key stakeholders in the community tell me the way it is. And now I take that information and take it up to my supervisors and making sure we can do something about it. Because let me tell you, when you're not being heard, there's a big, big frustration that happens. And then resentment starts and the trust starts to break down.
Thank you. I have a couple more questions, if that's right. It's great to have this survey data, to have a comparison of sort of how are people feeling about the work in 2015 and 2017. Do we have plans to go back and sort of keep checking against these questions? Because I think having a way to measure the way people are experiencing our policing over time would be extremely
Yeah,
Yes, sir. We are trying to figure out how to continue that work with the Urban Institute, because one of the things that we were very mindful of was we shouldn't be the ones asking that question. Mm-hmm. But we'd like to get the data back, but we also want a better equipped organization to scrub it and better focus it and understand it for us. So yes, I'm working on trying to find resources to continue the work. Just because the Procedural Justice National Initiative ended doesn't mean the work doesn't continue on. We just have to figure out how to do it, because we would like to loop back around.
And also, Councilmember Fletcher, a great question that I asked my PJ unit, and I have some community saying, well, how do you know PJ is working? And what we're planning on doing in 2020 this year here, not just with the PJ unit, but even with supervisors every precinct, we have to start being more proactive instead of reactive. Sergeants should actually periodically look at body cameras, and I always say, look it off, randomly do a traffic stop. You don't have to wait for a complaint to come. Was that officer being respectful? Was that officer being professional? And that's the accountability we have to start having too. So even having a PJ team do audits too, citywide, and even to each precinct and patrol. And that's just being more proactive, because if we say we have a program in place, what metrics are you using to measure that too? And right now we have body cameras, and going out there and actually looking at officers, because what we do a disservice with some officers when we look at complaints that come, and then I can do a history of that officer, and I can see this pattern develop through the years. And my question is, how come the supervisors didn't catch that? So trying to be more proactive too.
One of the things on the National Initiative website that's featured prominently right now is an article calling for an end to pretext stops, saying that those, particularly in the context of procedural justice, really undermine trust and undermine the goals of procedural justice. And so in that framework, they were talking about that, and I was happy to see that, because last year, obviously, we had the community coming here and pointing out racial biases in the data and concerns about that. Are we heading away from pretext stops? Is that a piece of this procedural justice work to really shift the way we think about traffic stops?
You know, we talk about the reason for stops, and when you talk about a stop for not having a valid reason for stopping an individual, and here's the dilemma that some officers face. When you have a situation, just say where you have a shot spotter, shots fired, or you have a suspect, and this suspect might, if it's on the north side, 94% of all suspects black males, and you don't have that specific information. So again, what's the reason why you're stopping people, and explain to people. That's part of procedural justice. Tell people the reason why you're stopping them, and just so you know, it's not a fair system. So if I stood up here and said it's a fair system, and why I say it's police alone can't solve these issues. So we have to do something where police officers aren't called to deal with all these shootings, all these stabbings, because that's where those pretext stops come from. When officers get frustrated, they go into certain neighborhoods and they see shots fired, they see homicides, they see shootings, and then they say, okay, well, here's the suspect information. And we all know only 3 to 6% of the people in any neighborhood are actually do criminal activity. So 93, 97% of the people, just good folks. So 97% of all stops are just against good folks. So the system's flawed. So that's something we're just looking at now. I don't have a answer, but I'm saying the reason why we're in these neighborhoods doing these stops is because that tool right now, when we see this trauma, we see this violence, and we're trying to stop that. It's tough.
I think I truly believe with the training that we're doing PJ3 with implicit bias and how to diffuse those traps, I have no doubt in my mind. Officers may not say in the training that like, oh my God, that happened to me. I was actually using my biases to treat somebody, right? But I'm pretty sure that when they go home and they think about what just happened and the training that they just got and how to just check yourself, right? We all have biases. When I walked in here and I'm wearing my orange, you may not like orange or you may not like my hair, and it's just something that came into your mind, right? When you're trained, you're able to recognize those things and to check your biases to where like you're not going to treat me differently because of the color of my skin, the clothes that I wear, or the way I walk. And that's what we're trying to train the officers, and that's why it's going to take a while, right? So we just started talking about implicit bias and saying that it's okay to have them. They just have to be better educated. And when you know how to defeat those traps that, oh, yeah, maybe before I would have stopped that group of young black male walking in North Minneapolis, but now after the training, it's like, what have they done that's illegal? Oh, nothing. I'm just going to drive by. How do you measure that? We can't really measure that. But I can guarantee you it's happening every single day. Because if you look at the statistic of our stops, it's all down, right? So I'm hoping they're down there because they don't do the work. I'm hoping that it's down because after the training, they're kind of realizing that, you know what? I don't really have a reason to stop this person. And I checked myself before I did it. Whereas before, I would have just done it and find a reason to stop them after.
Thanks.
Councilmember Cunningham.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you all so much for this presentation. And I just have to say first that I'm so grateful to be able to work with a police department that has this work happening within it. There are other elected officials from around the country that are my peers that I talk to, and they would dream of having a presentation like this coming from their own police department. So I first just want to name that piece of it, like that we having this work within the police department is really powerful. I have a slew of questions, if that's okay. First, I would just say that this would be helpful prior so that I could have a chance to read it, and because I would come back with even more questions. So just for future reference, I do read all the things you give us. So so just that. Okay, so first I wanted to ask the question, elaborate a little bit on Councilmember Fletcher's question. How many members are on your team for procedural justice? And are those folks specifically assigned to that? Or do we have officers who are in rotation in terms of like in the precincts that are within that work as well?
So currently, we have 3 officers assigned to the Procedural Justice Unit permanently, 1 sergeant, and also we have a lieutenant that's in charge of our unit, but she's also in charge of several other units. So permanently right now we have 4 people every single day doing procedural justice work. But we are in the process of finding also procedural justice leaders in each of the precincts to make sure that not only do they get procedural justice when it comes to training, but how do we make sure that within the year, the rest of the year, there's somebody in there that may be able to answer questions, or the leader of the procedural justice unit in each of the precincts. But with all the changes and the rotation that's happening, it's been really hard to maintain those people and to find and reach out to those people. But I can tell you that all of the inspectors are on board with this, and eventually that's what's going to happen, to where it happens everywhere, where people are talking about it. So hopefully that culture change that DC Knight is talking about, hopefully that's what's going to happen, where that's just what is expected. We're not going to be like, oh, I don't want to hear about procedural justice. It's just the way of the MPD. Last year, I put signs in all of the precincts, 2 to 3 signs in each of the precincts that remind the officers of what those 4 pillars are and what the expectation, when you cross that door and you go out in your patrol car, this is the expectation that not only the chief has, but on down all the way to your sergeant and each other, other officers. I remember being an officer, it's not too long ago, 12 years ago, where I remember sometimes working with people and I didn't really appreciate that they were talking to people. I didn't like that. I didn't want to work with these people because I didn't like the way they were treating people. But now, hopefully, eventually, it's just going to be the norm, where people that are going to treating people badly are going to be told as, hey, that's not how we do business here in MPD. That is the goal, ultimately.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Around the implicit bias work, one of the concerns that I have, just generally speaking about the procedural justice work is, while everybody is trained on it, I don't know how much that's actually showing up on the ground in terms of the work that I see happening in my ward. I'm not saying that there hasn't been changes, because I was in Mayor Hodges' office when this was rolled out and was peripherally involved. So I'm excited to be able to be here now in this position, 5 years later, basically being able to have this conversation and seeing really how it's rolling out. One of the things that I consistently hear from constituents is that rank and file officers will often complain about feeling handcuffed by this sort of work. And so it's like, well, now I can't pull people over because I'm going to be accused of being a racist. And so I can't do my job because of the fact that I'm going to be called a racist. And so I guess while it might be changing behaviors, I'm curious about how much it's changing like psychological thought processes, because there is that like an animosity almost like to the expected behavior change. So that's one component of it. The second component is that National Initiative, a part of the work was that they did blind data collection within the police department to be able to measure implicit bias overall within the police department. Is that still happening, or was that something that kind of phased out with the National Initiative?
Well, I talk about when we talk about changing the culture, it is changing the attitude. And I tell you, when you think about it, if you're a police officer, you're on a traffic stop, and someone is rude to you or someone is loud, obnoxious, it's natural for you to be that way back to that person. I mean, just human nature. But just with the training, we talk with officers, and I remember a complaint, and it was a verbal altercation. I asked the officer, why did you curse that person? He cursed at me. And I explained to the officer, I pay you to be professional if someone's an a-hole. I don't pay that a-hole. And if you can't treat people respectfully, professionally, how you want your family member or someone else treated, maybe you shouldn't work for Minneapolis Police Department. I'm sorry, I'm not as nice as Chief Arredondo sometimes, but sometimes if you have people who can't treat the residents of Minneapolis respectful, why are you working in Minneapolis? So if someone, like we had someone, I'll be honest, when we first did this work, someone said, this right here is just some liberal Obama BS. I said, what's liberal and what's BS about being respectful to people? You think about it, this right here is not a Republican project, it's not a Democratic project. It's being a police officer. I pay you to be respectful, I pay you to be professional. And when you apply for this job, and when we sat down and talked to you, you said you would do those things. So if you can't do those things, then maybe you shouldn't work for this department. So we have to have supervisors having us the same accountability for those officers. So if you have some officers who say, I can't be respectful to people, well, don't work in Minneapolis.
I think we talk about the biggest challenge is being able to do policing in a different way. And I think that's our job, to make the officer view what we're trying and equip them with the tools. Like I talked about, the training is putting tools on their tool belt, right? That's not a gun, pepper spray, or taser, right? It's like being respectful, listening to people. I can do my job, stop as many cars as I did before, but I do it with this in mind in the back of my head. If you stop somebody and the first thing you say is, give me your driver's license and proof of insurance, what do you think you're going to get in return, right? Whoa, right away, the fact that I'm getting stopped, there's already things going on. Now you see the uniform, more things are going on, and now on top of that, you're being rude, or it's being perceived rude. You could just say, hey, how's it going? I'm so-and-so. The reason why I'm stopping you, can I have a driver's license proof of insurance? Person's like, oh, okay. It just de-escalate the whole situation at the first impact, right? So we try to make officer understand that you can do everything that you were doing before. You just have to remember where you're coming from and where they're coming from. And the more they're equipped, the more they have tools, aside from their guns and pepper spray and taser, the better off they're going to be. But you know what? We're not all created equal. And we have some officers that they barely pass, and they're still officers, and we have the superstars, right? I think the biggest challenge that we have sometimes is when officers, let's say, work the night shift in certain areas, and all they see and all they deal with is people that don't like them. You could wave at somebody, and they don't wave back. You can say hi to somebody, they're not going to respond because of all the other dynamics that are going on. So those are the officers that really want to focus on, because we have to make them understand that there's 93 to 95% of the population that like you, that want to work with you, that want to have a relationship with you. And you have to put that in perspective. People don't call you to come celebrate a birthday party. They call you when something went wrong at that birthday party. So you need to understand that when you encounter people, it's in their worst day. And if you don't go into a situation understanding that this person needs help, right? The situation became out of control, and that's why they called you. And your job is to make that person whole again and make them feel safe. And when you leave it better off than when you first arrived. And that's what we always have to keep driving and driving, and we understand that. And that's why it's important when you're not answering calls, how do you get to meet people in the area that you patrol? If you have no connection, no human connection, no face-to-face, they don't know who you are, you don't know them, the way you're going to have that interaction with them when they call you in crisis is going to be completely different. If I show up at your house, City Councilmember Cano, we've worked together for several years, you already know who I am, it's going to be a completely different interaction. Me seeing you, you seeing me. But the majority of the time when you answer, they've never seen you before. And all they know is previous interaction or some of their friends' interaction or what they've seen on social media. That is their frame of reference.
Right. Well, so I think that I really like you a lot, because I love your leadership, the way that you really embody this philosophy. I'm grateful to have you as a part of this work. I watch a lot of body cam footage in this role, and I can say that I do not see de-escalation frequently. That is something that is troublesome, because you just gave a really beautiful example of like how to be able to, like, if I'm pulled over, I'm probably already amped, right? Like I'm already like, you're bothering me, I didn't do anything, right? And if the officer is meeting me at that energy, then that's escalating, right? And so you just gave a really good example of how to anchor in that moment. We have, as a result of complaints, for example, we have to pay out a lot of settlements as a result. And one of the things I'm curious about is where are there opportunities for reflection and debriefing when those sort of settlements come through? Because, you know, when, for example, I watch the body cam footage, I'm like, there's a moment of de-escalation, opportunity missed, there's that opportunity missed, there's that opportunity missed. Are there opportunities, like if, let's say that the complaint happens in the 4th precinct, that officers, the folks are able to like sit down and, I don't know, during roll call or whatever, be able to sit down and review that body cam footage and reflect on when there was missed opportunities for de-escalation? Like, what kind of reflection opportunities are there to learn from the mistakes and actually implement this in real life?
That's a training in progress. And I think, like DC and I mentioned earlier, it starts with their direct supervisor. If the direct supervisor is not aware of what's going on with their officers, they're not in the street with them and don't see, sometimes they may have a bad day, right? We all have bad days, and sometimes they might say something or do something that they wouldn't have done if they would not have been doing through that bad day. Officers go through the same thing as everybody else. And I think that having there's those moments. I mean, when I was a supervisor in the street, I had those moments every single time they would happen. And I would sit down with the officer, I said, do you understand that you drove this incident up? Whereas you should have done the opposite. It's dangerous to you, it's dangerous to the person, and they get it. But you have to catch those things, and you have to be very mindful that these things are happening all the time. So with the training that we're doing, with the supervisors and the precinct inspectors and the chief on down, it is happening more than ever before. But again, there's a lot of work to do. And that's why when I say that citizen that may have a complaint, if they feel they have an ally in the police department, that's somebody they can go to that they trust and say, hey, this is what happened, right? After the situation is over, things calm down, and you come to me and say, hey, this is what happened. What are you going to do? Well, I can review the body cam, and if I agree that what happened, what they're describing, we can talk about it, bring it back to my supervisor, and making sure that that does not happen again. Because when that happened, a lot of times, if you look at several videos, you might see a pattern, and that's what we're talking about. How are we proactive to make sure that this event does not get worse than in just, like I say, a language of disrespecting somebody? So I think it's important that we're going to review videos. That's a policy that's going to come down to where everybody's doing it. And everybody knows that, you know what, when that body cam turns on, it can be reviewed, it will be critiqued, and we have to do something about it. But I would love to hear more about it. Outside of this,
I'd love to talk to you more just about some ideas that I've had around that. So,
yeah, and Councilmember Cunningham, every time we have a major incident, we always have a debriefing, and that's what's nice about having a partnership with the City Council, and maybe having that more. If we can talk about lawsuits, talk about other incidents too. But every now, when we have like a officer-involved shooting, we have the RNC when the president came, and we debrief those major incidents, and like. Sergeant Dubuque said, you have some individual sergeants who might do that, but it's not within policy. So maybe just having a spread across the board, hey, let's talk about this. And here's the only thing that I have a little pushback, and sometimes I used to get frustrated when I used to look at body cam footage. I was only looking at body cam footage for complaints. You look at every year we do about 400 to 500,000 calls for service and 2 million contacts. And the only calls we really look at is the ones where it's complaints. So the vast majority of that footage is officers being respectful, professional. And I have to remind myself that because when I'm, as an administrator, guess what I look at? Just when a complaint comes in. So we just can't judge that we have 3 to 6% of cops who shouldn't be cops. And I'll be the first one to say that. We have some members on this department who shouldn't be here, but the vast majority of them should be here. And if you just looked at all the body cam footage, you get a different story. But it's hard when you just look at complaints.
I agree. I think, though, where the challenge is around that nuanced perspective is that those 3 to 6% of folks are the ones who perpetuate that historical trauma, right? And so when we look at it, it's like there's an opportunity for collective learning, even with the other large percentage of folks, of like, how do we do better and be able to. So I'd love to talk more about that. I'll just ask one more question and then I'll pass it along. Actually, I'm sorry too. So I saw that one of the things that you all have worked on is changes to the transgender and gender non-conforming policy. Can you tell me more about that? Council Vice President Jenkins and I worked on that, so I'm curious about what changes were made.
So during this fall training, we picked LGBTQIA+ as a historical trauma piece of talking this year, last year, 2019, 50th anniversary of Stonewall. I met with City Council Jenkins. We talked about how can we put a robust training to the officers to understand the dynamic that's going on with the community. And I specifically highlighted the new policy that came out in 2016 of how to deal with and when you encounter people of the non-binary, transgender community, and how there's just like little nuances that make such a big difference with these people. We talk about pronouns, how important those pronouns are. And now all of the officers and the civilians working for the police department are educated. And that's what I'm talking about. Like we want to bring tools to their tool belt that doesn't involve weaponized stuff. That's what I'm talking about. Now we talk also about the driver's license, having an X where people can choose not to select M or F for male and female. Officers being aware of that. It's a great opportunity and moment to show that you're educated and aware of some of the things going on by saying, hey, how would you like me to refer to you when you see that X? So all little cues and things that we put scenario so they understand how can we use this information that's provided to us in the community. So those are the things that we talked about this fall.
Cool. And then the last question I'll ask is what does collaboration look like with other departments? I think that this work is really amazing, but there's also a lot of other stakeholders, namely the Office of Violence Prevention. So I'm just curious, what does collaboration look like within the Procedural Justice Unit?
Well, the work, Councilmember Cunningham, Council Chair, the work that we're doing within the enterprise, actually, with other departments, is like with the community navigators. We work with the Office of Violence Prevention through our group violence intervention work. We're parties and parcels to it, doing custom notifications, having, say, my East African / Somali navigator attend those customs in case there's questions of language, questions of culture, working with NCR to make sure that our outreach efforts are all coordinated and working with in a much better coordinated way so that we're not duplicating efforts. We're sort of maximizing the resources that we have. Everyone has limited resources, but also just making sure that we all have the same goal. We don't want, we're trying to stop crime. We're trying to prevent crimes and working with that, and also better informed community for resources or options or opportunities. So, I mean, that's sort of the work that we're doing. We know we have our lane, but we're also always looking around and always trying to find partners within the enterprise and outside of it. We all know that we have these different intersections. Meet at those intersections, find out what we can do together, because that's a better way for us to do it. And once again, it's a different way for the police department to show up. Just in the case of the navigators, it's non-law enforcement personnel who are in that gap, that bridge between community and police department. And sometimes it's just different to have someone to talk to that, the uniform doesn't trigger anything, or get you worked up just because they're there. That's a good thing, I think, in the long run, and it's a much better way for us to do business.
What I tell people is we want the police department to be a one-stop shop. When people come to me, I always tell them, I say, okay, what are you looking for? I'm not just going to show up into a space not knowing what your expectations are. So if you want me to be in plain clothes, you want me with no gun, you want me in full uniform, what exactly are we trying to do? So before we show up in a space, I always like to talk with people. I said, a lot of times, if I bring a bunch of white folks talking to a minority group, it may not go as well. So what exactly would you like? So it's like, well, what can we do? At first, they don't know that we're willing to work with people and make sure that the impact that we're trying to have is the impact we're going to have. I have 2 black females working for me with dreads, super smart, super nice. They up-and-comers. They will be supervisors one day, and that's what I'm talking about. And we have the community engagement team we can pull from. We've been working with NCR now. They're helping us teaching this fall to the officers, which was the first time we're starting to work together, and they were so excited. We're excited to partake in some of the training that they may have. The more we work together, the more we don't duplicate efforts, the more we don't work in silos, which happens so often. Our new lieutenant is great in trying to bridge everybody together, where everybody is talking, everybody's sharing the resources, because we have to stretch everything, right? But while working together, we'll be able to make it happen. I have no doubt about it.
Councilmember Jenkins.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you all for this presentation. Like Councilmember Cunningham, I too was involved 5 years ago when this whole process began, and I was actually invited community member to be a part of some of the early dialogues. And, you know, I think the people were from John Jay College as they were, and they started out the whole presentation talking about sort of the historical beginnings of policing in America and why that, how police forces gained prominence in our country. And, you know, I mean, from the whole slave catcher history, which I know you guys know very well. So, you know, just to state the obvious, we know officers know how to be respectful to community members because they are respectful to the majority of community members. Sir, you know, we noticed you didn't have your turning signal on. Can you show us your license? You know, but generally that's for the broader community, for the white members of our community. When it comes to our black and brown community, the issues change, and that's where we see the most challenges. That's where we get the most complaints from. That's where we know there is the largest disparities. Just Monday, there was a person who was sentenced in St. Paul for shooting 2 police officers. This guy shot 2 police officers. He's going to jail, right? That's how it should be, right? We have black perpetrators without a gun who get murdered. So this is really about race, and we have to make sure we're keeping that at the forefront of our efforts to try and change the trajectory and the mentality of our police department. I do want to commend you guys for continuing to do this work. I know how ambitious programs get started and then, you know, they sort of fade away. So really appreciative that 5 years later, there is still heavy momentum, strong. I mean, we hear about the Procedural Justice Unit in almost every presentation that we get from you guys, and I think that is commendable in keeping the energy and the effort from one chief to this new chief, and that's positive. I want to continue to be supportive, but you know, we really need to make sure we're keeping our eyes focused on what the real issue seems to be, and that there's this racial element to how policing happens in our city.
You know, thanks for those comments, Councilmember Jenkins. And I know this is off topic, but I'm in charge of recruitment, and I tell everyone this, and I will continue to say this. We become a better police department, better city, I don't care, fire, whatever, when we have departments that reflect the people we serve. And I'm a strong advocate for that. I think the police department, historically, the police department has not done a great job how we interact with minorities. We have not done a great job hiring females, especially females of color, and we need to do a better job. And if we don't do that, we put a burden on our officers and we put a burden on our citizens. So race is so important. And I believe, we just become a better department when we can do that. And that's a topic that we can talk about. But we have to have a department that reflect the people we serve.
All righty. I have a few questions, and then I know Councilmember Palmisano has some comments. Could you go back to the slide? There was one bullet point at the very bottom of the slide that said internal police culture or something like that. Right here. Research on internal police dynamics. I'm curious about what that means, what some of the top 3 themes that you have identified, and whether or not that includes addressing a common question that we get as council members, which is our police community relations would be so much better if more of our officers lived in Minneapolis. So I'm trying to suss out all of those kind of connections and how they relate to this research on internal police dynamics question.
Councilmember Connell, ma'am, the research on internal police dynamics, we didn't address living in the city or anything like that, but it was more about the dynamics of interaction between officers. It was more about looking at health and wellness from fatigue standards and how they felt about where they worked and what they did and who they worked with, just to get a better understanding and sort of level set. How do you feel about the work you do? We know that this is what I affectionately call sort of a lifetime job. To get to the end, you're going to spend 25 to 30 years doing it. It's really important with how you feel like you're treated, so that if you're treated well, hopefully you reflect that to the communities you serve. But also, what are the internal dynamics? Do you feel heard? Do you feel listened to? Are there clear paths to ascend? In some cases, there are officers who say, I jumped in a squad car first day. That's all I ever want to do. There are others who want to ascend to gain, skills and have much more influence. Is that path laid out? And we were asking questions of that just to sort of get a gauge of where we were at as a department, because we felt like that was important, because that PJ works internal and external. And the important part of internal was just letting everyone be heard, feeling like they've been heard, and actually taking that and applying it in a way. So that's what we were looking at in that space.
Thank you for clarifying that. Curious, I do acknowledge that we're, as a city, we are trying to spend more time and resources, grants, personnel time in community healing, addressing trauma. Equally as important is helping our officers to self-heal and not internalize the trauma that they experience on the streets as well, so that it bubbles up into something negative within the workplace. Is your team, is the work that your team leads, is it connected at all to I believe the work that Mr. Savageau leads around officer wellness, and do you all talk about sort of troubleshooting together, and do you do joint trainings or something? I'm just trying to see what the connection is between those two realms of work.
Well, with the work with Savageau's unit, it's pretty much when we talk about trauma, we talk about officer wellness. So just say the PJ unit works with the commander of the training unit and deal with the internal piece, how our officers feeling and going out there. But we can do a better job of that. Mm-hmm. In the past, we both talked about wellness, but we haven't worked together jointly. We coordinate with the training unit, the PJ, about the training we have, and then Savageau works closely with the training unit also, but we haven't done any joint training together.
Okay. So. I would love for you all to explore that a little bit more. I know that in the 3rd Precinct, as you know, when you were in that geographic location, there was a pilot project that then Inspector Catherine Johnson was leading, just bringing officers together sort of informally to debrief and talk through some of the issues that they had experienced on the street. And I believe there may or may not have been a licensed therapist that was kind of helping to co-facilitate some of those discussions. So those models exist, and I know that Savageau is aware of those because we've had meetings about them. I don't know how much they have actually been operationalized within the department, but just thinking about how we as a city do spend a lot of resources on this topic, whether it's the Office of Violence Prevention, the GVI program, now the initiative we're launching with LEAD, based on the LEAD model, the Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion Program. And I noticed that you did say there was a diversion program that you do. I would love to see more synergy between all of those things and make sure that we're all leveraging and leaning on each other internally to co-learn and co-create initiatives that are stronger together and that are able to, so you're not siloed. My last question is, on the list here on page 6 of the binder that you gave us, and thank you very much for bringing this binder forward. I'm going to be using this a lot throughout this year. I noticed that we list a bunch of policy initiatives that we changed and that the department led in changing from 2016 to 2018. Curious if you anticipate more of this do you have a list for 2019, and do you anticipate a list for 2020 in terms of, will there be ongoing policies that you want to make sure you highlight that are part of this breadth of work? Because I see we did stuff in 2016, 2017, 2018, and I think it'd be good to keep that bucket list going. And so I'd love to have the list for 2019 once you have it, and then if you're anticipating things for 2020, making sure that we're all communicating and reporting back that list at the end of the year, so council members are aware and can share with the community, these are the policy changes that are continuing to happen.
Oh, yes, ma'am.
Do you have one for 2019 yet?
No, I do not at this moment. I would have to look at what changes we made.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's asking for best practices,
Mm-hmm.
and then comparing that, and then also comparing that with state statute and city statute, just to make sure that we're all in alignment, and then we try to pass it through the procedural
Yep.
justice lens
Mm-hmm.
to make sure that we can reflect it best.
Okay, I'll follow up with you all on that one. And then Councilmember Palmisano? Okay.
Why don't you go ahead and let Councilmember Cunningham.
Cunningham? Okay, Councilmember Cunningham.
I'm so sorry. I enjoy this conversation very much. You brought up GVI a couple times, and I wanted to ask about that a little bit because it's a demonstration project of procedural justice and the national initiative. So can you please explain how procedural justice, so that folks in the public have a better understanding, how does procedural justice manifest through the group violence intervention program, and are there any other initiatives that are connected with procedural justice and the national initiative that's currently in motion?
Right. Okay, let me make sure I have all that. How procedural justice manifests through GVI, the most obvious one is the officers who work with GVI have all had extra doses of procedural justice training in their lens. Also, during the custom notifications, I'm sure you're aware of those processes of, one of the things I do is add the navigators to them, and we have people who go along to sort of make sure that everyone within that space is being serviced, because sometimes it's intimidating, it's scary, but it's an honest and actual and demonstrated offer of help, service. From a procedural justice lens, we try to make sure that is demonstrated, it is spoken, it is. We understand that it can be a terrifying moment, but we are actually offering something that is true, is honest, and when we do it in a procedurally just manner, it's much better received. Like I said, for me, the demonstrated part of it is like the navigators going along, especially, like I said, our East African, our Latinx navigator. We know there's issues of culture, there's issues of language. It's the idea that we're demonstrating our work through that, and that's where that partnership comes in with OVP and the GVI team, and also also another demonstrated part of that is bringing some of the folks from the GVI side, the OVP side, into some of our trainings with our community navigators. some of our retreat work that we're doing to help deal with the trauma of kind of going out there and doing that, blending that to sort of get us all involved, all to understand each other, to understand that they're doing a lot of hard work that we may not see, we may not truly understand, but to respect it and to say, okay, this is a partnership, true partnership. Respect what you do, respect what we do, but more than anything, we're a team. And so we can lean on each other a little bit better. And when we see that, that gets reflected back out to the line officers, the patrol officers, and they see, okay, they're kind of part of the family. We're all one big family. And that's what we're hoping to continue and grow as we expand, hopefully, to Southside soon.
And Councilmember Cunningham, when you look at, when we say just changing the culture of law enforcement, traditionally, what do we do in law enforcement? You lock people up to reduce crime. And even like with the GVI model, you think about it, what can we do to help you to change your circumstances so you won't commit crime? And that's the true transformation when you're talking with your officers. And that's when you get some pushback. Like even when I was one of the original trainers, and I'm like, it's kind of hard for me to be nice to people who are not nice. And sitting down and saying, no, we have to start. We just can't continue the old processes locking people up. We can't afford to do that.
Right.
And it's a lot of people in a lot of circumstances who we have to help change their circumstances. We can reduce crime and reduce incarceration rate. And you talk about 10 years ago, no one would ever thought about that. So I think that purpose with GVI and law enforcement procedural justice, how can we reduce incarceration, reduce crime, and then give people more opportunities?
For clarification, for the community navigators, are they only deployed in custom notifications when there's language barriers?
No.
So we also have the African American and
Yes.
Native American. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
And sometimes it's just a matter of being in the room and knowing what's going on. And like you said, it's that those folks who can stand in the gap and explain it and maybe follow up, because a lot of times what I found is the message is given, and there may be someone else in the room who it's not directed towards, but they're there. And then it's nice for them to be able to follow up later and kind of go, okay, this is what I heard. Is this real? Is this true? And to assuage them and give them some comfort and some peace to say, yes, this is honest and true. And, we find out that there's others who may need other forms of help that the navigators can follow up on.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Palmisano.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate how the national initiative was the response to our DOJ subcommittees. Many people in this room, in the audience, and up here were part of that effort. And I fear that some of the things we're talking about here don't fit into it or our procedural justice training quite so neatly. And it has to do with trauma. Trauma is impactful, whether generational or people going through crisis in their home, in their community, or career filled with stress types of trauma. And I think it's time we see the connection between performance of people in the field and our lack of modern resources. Police organizations classically are not exactly the organizations with great interdisciplinary reach. That's not a negative on MPD. It's to me, it's about how we do policing in this country, and it's not just classically. It just doesn't have much interdisciplinary reach, right? Trauma has a deep impact on how we show up, and I know that people respond differently and transform when we show up differently, and that's part of what you were talking about, Sergeant. And we have attitude problems on our department, and when we do, that impacts everybody that wears that uniform on that department. I know that if our officers don't show up in ways with collaboration skills, with compassion, with all the other tools in their tool belt, as you said, that we're screwed. So when we talk about being proactive, I don't know if this is part of procedural justice training or not, but I hope that the evolution of this work. I know that the evolution of some of the training happening in the police department, both academy training and in-service training, is toward training for trauma, right? Preventive and proactive training for keeping our officers well. I'd like to expand it to first responders in general, to showing officers how they can stay calibrated and well and show up day after day with all of those tools in their tool belt. So the idea of check yourself also means knowing how, and knowing how to deal with that within themselves in this career level trauma, if indeed policing continues to be a career that people stay in 20 to 30 years. In the paper today, there's an article about a St. Paul officer, Dennis Jensen, and how great he was at fostering the community, at being bridges, at all of his skills. And it was really more, they were highlighting for a police officer how his other skills in talking to people, in working with people, are what made him so particularly special and successful. And it just makes me wonder, how do we foster more of that? Because I do think that's something that can be fostered in this profession, instead of just being managed to. So yes, I absolutely agree with you. My interest is direct supervisors being accountable and looking at more body camera footage, and making sure that we drive that accountability in the department. I think we need more of an ability, though, to both help officers prepare for these lives of trauma, and also hold unprofessional behavior accountable. I'd like to help officers be directed to appropriate resources better than we have in the past. And I wasn't at, but heard all of the great work in our award ceremony back in December. There is a lot of great work going on, and it's important to lift those things up. But I think we also need to kind of get out of the rubric of this is all the training that you need in your life for your work, because the work of first responders, and in particular peace officers, goes far beyond what they handle at the office. They don't just shut the lid on it and go home. So thank you for this presentation. I wonder if some of the procedural justice work that we have will bleed into these other areas, or maybe, in what I've found in working with mindfulness stuff in the police department, is that's just a different piece of the training puzzle and of the in-service stuff that we're trying to get our officers more support on. So thank you for this presentation.
Councilmember Palmisano, we want to thank you, too, for being the champion for officer wellness, because I can tell you one thing now is a stigma for some officers to say they need help. And it's not just Minneapolis, across the country, because the one thing that a lot of officers are afraid of is, if I say I need help, then they're going to take away my gun, they'll take away my badge and my whole livelihood. So what Chief Arredondo, Assistant Chief Jose talks about, making it a norm for everyone to have check-ins. It's okay to have issues and someone to actually talk to. I would rather you be okay as a person. His job is secondary. Your family is more important in your life. It's more important than his job. But again, we're not just, it's challenging for us, but departments across the country right now. That's the number one issue right now. And then later on, when we look at more officers actually died by suicide last year than by violence in the U.S. And that stigma, I can't tell anybody I'm feeling pain because I'm going to lose my profession. And that's what we're struggling to battle with that now. So yeah, thank you guys for that.
Thank you so much. I'm not seeing any more questions or comments, so thank you all for this discussion, for this information, and I'm sure that many of us will be following up with you on other things that we're interested in. So appreciate you being here, and thank you for your hard work.
And we have not, I apologize, we have not offered you guys an invite. We have a recruit class that's starting, and you guys are invited or aid to our procedural justice class. So we have a new class starting, and what we're going to do this time is we're going to break it into 4-hour blocks. So if you guys want to attend or send some of your aides for the procedural justice training, you're more than welcome to.
Yeah, please send us the invitation. Please do. We'd be really interested. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, we have to formally adopt our agenda and then approve the items here now that we have quorum. So our agenda was read earlier today for the public. All those in favor of approving the agenda, please say aye. Aye. And now we will receive and file this procedural justice report from the Minneapolis Police Department. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. With no further business. Oh, thank you. We have one consent item, so all those in favor of approving the consent item, please say aye. Aye. Okay, looks like we're done. So without any other business before us, we are adjourned. Thank you.